Let's try to recap what we did in Chapter 8. Review here. Question number 1. This says to simplify. Two times the square root of 36. That's 2 times, what is the square root of 36? 6. And 2 times 6 will be what? 12. Question number 2. Again, simplify. -3, the square root of 45. Now, I have no idea what the square root of 45 is. But I know 45 is what? 9 times 5. That's what 45 is. Which means I can take this problem, break it down to the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. What is the square root of 9? The square root of 9 is 3 times the square root of 5. Now these two numbers don't have a square root with them, so you can multiply them out. What's -3 times the -3? That's -9 the square root of 5. Okay, let's simplify this one. Again, that's a multiplication, we just don't put the multiplication between them. So I can break it down to the square root of 32 times the square root of x to the third times the square root of y. Well, we have a little problem. This one, not much I can do to simplify it. Done. This one, I don't know the square root of x cubed because I can't divide 3 by 2. So what I might be able to do, write that as x squared times x. Because when you multiply, you add your exponents. 2 and 1, that's a 3. And the 32, I can write that 16 times 2. Now the answer to this is what? The answer to this is 4. The answer to this, you take the power and divide it by 2, that's x. So I can take these two answers, 4 times x, which is what? 4x. And what's left is the square root of 2, the square root of x, the square root of y. Instead of putting this with 3 square roots, you can combine them into 1 and make it 4x, the square root of 2xy. Simplify. The square root of 5n over 16. Again, we can take this and break it down, the square root of 5n over the square root of 16. What is the square root of 16? That's a 4. 5, I have no idea what the solution to it, neither n. So this one stays 5n, square root of that, over 4. the square root of x, minus 3 the square root of x, plus 5 the square root of x. The good news here, the square root, every one of them has x in it. That's it. So these are the same type, matching. There is no number in the front, which means it's a 1. So now we go, what is 1 minus 3? 1 minus 3 is a negative 2. Negative 2 plus the 5, that's 3 of them, and the square root of x stays the same. Now you can't add square root if they're not like terms. Like these guys are the same type. 18, 50, and 8 are not the same thing, so I can't combine them together. But if I do simplify each one of them, maybe I might make them the same, like radicals. The 8, I can break it down to 4 times 2. Here's the 4. The 50 I can break it down to 25 and 2. And the 18 I can break it down to 9 and 2. Again, notice I'm using numbers I know the answer to. 25 times 2 instead of 10 and 5. 9 times 2 instead of 6 and 3. Because I know what the square root of 9, I know what the square root of 25. So the square root of 4, that's a 2 with the radical of 2. There's the minus. 4 times, what is the square root of 25? Is 5. And you still have the square root of 2. And here, what's the square root of 9? That's 3. The square root of 2. Now these are like radicals, so we can combine them. 2 minus 20 is negative 18, plus 3 is 21, the square root of 2. Wait a minute. My mistake. 2 minus 20 is what? Negative 18 plus 5 is negative 15. Fell asleep here. Two minus 20, or 2 and 3 is actually a 5. 5 minus 20 is negative 15. It's been a long day. Let's try this one. Simplify. Number 7. T, the square root of 4t, plus 2, the square root of 16t cubed. Now the 4t, excuse me, the 4t I can break it down to 4 and t. This one I can break it down the square root of 16 and t cubed. The square root of 4 is actually a 2. The square root of 16 is 4. Now t cubed, I don't know the square root of that because you can't divide 3 by 2. But I can take it and break it down to t squared times t. What's 2 times t? 2t, the square root of t. 2 times 4, 8. What is the square root of t squared? That's still a t. Times the square root of t. Notice these are exactly like terms. They have t and the square root of t in both them. So what is 2 plus 8? And the answer is 10t, the square root of t. Let's try multiplication. What is the square root of 12 times the square root of 2? Well, I know I can combine them into one. 12 times 2, which is what? 24. And the question, can I simplify that? Because if you can simplify it, you have to simplify it. You don't have an option. So 24, I can break it down to 4 times 6. I chose 4 because I know the answer to it. And what is the square root of 4? We said that's a 2 times the square root of 6. The square root of 75 divided by the square root of 3. I can make that one radical, 75 over 3. And what is 75 over 3? Isn't that 25? And the square root of 25 is just simply 5. Multiply and simplify. Even if it doesn't say simplify, if it just says multiply, you still have to simplify. Five x to the third y times 5x squared y. Now you can make that one square root. In it, 5x to the third y times 5x squared y. And when you multiply these, you remember you multiply the numbers and you add the exponents. 5 times 5, 25. X to the power, add the exponents. Now multiply, add them. 3 plus 2, 5. Y to what power? 1 plus 1, you add the exponent, which is 2. I can break it down, the square root 25. I can do the square root of x to the fifth. And I can do the square root of y squared. The 25 gives me a 5. The y squared, the square root of that is just y. But what about x to the fifth? I got to break it down to 4 and 1. Because when you multiply, you add the exponent. And what is the square root of x to the fourth? That's x squared. And it doesn't matter which one you write first. I'll multiply the ones without the square root. 5 times x squared times y. and that will be 5x squared y. And what's left under the square root? Just the square root of x. Let's try this. We'll multiply the square root of y times 5 times the square root of y minus 1. Again, you're going to take this, multiply it by both of these, distribute that. So it's going to be 5, the square root of y, that's this one, times this. Square root of y times 1 is the square root of y. Is the 5. When you multiply a square root by itself, you lose the square root. You end up with y, so it's 5y minus the square root of y. The square root of 3 plus 4 squared. Again, that means the square root of 3 plus 4 times the square root of 3 plus 4. Don't just square this and square that. It doesn't work. And we have to use the FOIL method. What is the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 when you multiply them? You're multiplying a square root by itself, that's just a 3. This one, this doesn't have a square root, so we write that for the square root of 3. This one now, for the square root of 3. And finally this one, which is what? 16. 3 plus 16, we can combine them, that's 19. 4 and 4, that's 8, the square root of 3. Simplify. Again, that will give me the square root of 2p over the square root of 5. And I can't really simplify either one. But remember, our book, most books, not just our book, they don't want to see a square root in the bottom. You have to rationalize that. To rationalize it, you're going to multiply the top and the bottom by the square root of 5. And if you do that, in the bottom you'll end up with just 5, because you're multiplying a square root times itself. And this will be, what is 2 times 5? 10p. Simplify again. (48) x to the 5th divided by 2x. You can combine these into one radical. (48) divided by 2, which is what? 24. X to what power? You subtract the exponent. 5 minus 1, which is 4. So that's equal to the square root 24 times the square root of x to the fourth. 24 can be broken down to what? 4 and 6? And the square root of x to the fourth, that's x squared. 4 divided by 2 is 2. The square root of 4 is 2. 2 times the x squared, that would be 2x squared, the square root of 6. That's because that's a 2. 2 times that, and I like to put the square root way at the end. Rationalize the denominator. Which means they don't want to see a square root in the bottom. So to get rid of the square root in the bottom, we don't care about the top. You're going to multiply it by the square root of 3. So if you multiply that, and this will be the square root of 3 minus 2 the square root of 6 times the square root of 3. And let's distribute that. This times this, and this times this. Square root of 3 times the square root of 3, that's just a 3. Square root of 6 times the square root of 3, we can put them together as 6 times 3, which is 18. That should have been a 3, not a square root of 3 here. Don't cancel these. Not yet, nope. There's a subtraction between them. The 8 can be broken down to 9 and 2. What is the square root of 9? That's a 3. Now notice on the top you can factor 3 out. If you factor 3 out, what's left? 1 minus 2 the square root of 2 over 3. So I factor 3 out. This is 3 times 1. I just don't put the 1. You take the 3 out of each one. There's a 1 left here minus there's the 2 and the square root of 2. And the reason I want to factor the 3 because these two will cancel each other out. And my answer for this question will be 1 minus 2 the square root of 2. Couple more questions, then we're done. Solve for x. The square root of 5x plus 1 minus the 2 equals to 4. Again, I only see one square root, which means I need to isolate that. To isolate that, the minus 2 has to go there. And that becomes a plus 2. And what is 4 plus 2? Isn't that a 6? So I did isolate the square root. Step number 2, square both sides now to get rid of the square root. When you do that, this becomes 5x plus 1, 6 squared, which is what? 36. Take this plus 1 to that side. 5x equals what? 36 minus the 1. And to solve for x, you're going to divide both sides by 5. X equals 7. And before we get excited about it, oh, that's the good answer, let's check and make sure it works. Check answer. Is 5 times 7 plus 1 minus the 2, does that equal to 4? 5 times 7 is 35 and 1 is 36. Is the square root of 36 minus 2, does that equal to 4? Square root of 36 is 6. Is 6 minus 2 equals to 4? Yes, it is. So that is a good answer. One more. Solve for x. Square root of x plus 11 equals square root of 7x minus 1. The good news for us is they have the two square roots isolated, one on each side. Because anytime you have two of them, that's what you need to do. Make sure you only have one on each side. Then square them. And again, when you square a square root, it's gone. I want all the x's on one side, all the numbers on the opposite side. The minus 1 comes to this side, becomes a plus 1, plus the 11. The 7x I never touched, so it doesn't change. When you bring that x to this side, it becomes a minus x. 12 equals 6x. X will have to be 12 divided by 6, which means what? 2. Let me check my answer. Is that equal to, question mark, 7 times 2, which is what? 14 minus 1. 2 plus 11 is 13. 14 minus 1 is 13. Yes, they are equal. So that is a good answer. And that's the end of chapter 8. There's plenty other questions we can do, but I think you probably get the idea.